Welcome to the American Society of Quality Lean Enterprise Division 2016 webinar series. By listening to our webinar series, you will get the best of the best in the lean industry. Stay tuned to the end of this recording for more details. This month, our speaker is Ron Mascitelli, the industry leader in applying lean concepts to product development. Ron has several books available on the subject of lean product development. One of the most powerful and proven methods of lean product development is the use of visual communication to save time, reduce ambiguity, and focus attention on the critical issues that determine product development success. Let's join Ron as he presents Visual Tools for Lean Product Development.
Depending on where you are, it's still morning where I am on the West Coast. So what we're going to do is, obviously in the short time we have, it's impossible to cover the full spectrum of lean product development, but I will endeavor to give you an introduction that kind of motivates what it is, why it works, what the benefits are, and give you a big picture framework, because this is a front-to-back methodology from the earliest stages of business case formation all the way through to product launch. We're then going to focus in, and let me switch to the agenda, we're going to focus in on an example of some of the tools and methods, and in particular visual workflow management, which is probably the most widely adopted of the things that I teach, and certainly has been incredibly successful in almost every type of industry, from commercial products, food products, consumer, heavy industrial, aerospace, automotive. It's broadly applicable, and so I'll try to give you some practical takeaways there in the brief time that we have. So first of all, what is lean product development? Those of you, and most of you I believe, are serious practitioners of lean. Everything you will see today and in this methodology is both inspired and founded in the same lean principles that we use in the factory, in the front office, and throughout the enterprise. However, this is not a round peg and square hole adaptation of lean manufacturing principles. These are designed by and for people who do research and development, engineering, and design. And so their connections are absolutely there. If we had time, I could explain all of them to you. But the same methods and principles are working and successful in the development environment, but have to be adapted to those needs. So the goal here is efficiency and effectiveness. We can always gain efficiencies by just cutting things. Instead, what we're doing is finding, in particular, focusing on the enablers of product development, finding both better, faster, and simpler ways to achieve the best possible outcome. So some of the key benefits of this: true cross-functional collaboration, and that word true is kind of critical. Almost all of us now know we need to use concurrent engineering, integrated product teams, whatever the word you use. However, the true collaboration is when those people are working together as a team, sharing knowledge, helping each other, supporting the goal, taking a real emotional involvement in the process, and that's something that's much harder to achieve. All of these methods are designed at a certain level to be human engineering methods, to help people overcome the human aspects of functional departments and different languages within the process of development, and be able to really work together well. Rapid and effective decision making is critical, because product development is basically a decision process from start to finish. What concept do we choose? What technology do we apply? When are we ready to go to market? Is the test data good? All of these things are basically collective decisions, and if we can do that better and faster and with better feedback, the process goes dramatically better. Capturing knowledge for reuse. This is a knowledge-driven process. All of the lean product development methods that I'll share with you and that I teach are self-documenting knowledge capture methods. So instead of having to do extra work to capture the learning from a team, this methodology actually captures the knowledge as you go. So you can archive it, refer to it in the future, build on it in future projects and teams. And then lastly, eliminating, of course, wasted time, cost, and resource capacity. All of this is intended to fit within an existing process. It is a standalone methodology, and for the most mature companies in this arena, we can actually use this as the governance process for lean product development or new product development. But if you have a phase gate or a stage gate process, this will fit within the process. It's the how of the process, if you will. I always say it's kind of the WD-40 of product development. It'll lubricate whatever current process you have. So in that sense, it's modular and non-invasive to your existing infrastructure and governance. So a few fundamental principles just to set the stage here. probably the most important one, early is always better. One of the mistakes or suboptimal things that we do in new product development is sort of a ready, fire, aim mentality. Rather than really taking the time and focus up front in the project to what? Understand clearly customer requirements. Several of you mentioned that as being super critical. Capturing voice of the customer, systematically and carefully converting that into design requirements. Early collaborative planning of the project, not just the project leader or team leader coming up with a straw man plan, putting it in place, and the team follows it, but actually engaging the entire cross-functional team in the planning process so they understand the plan and they buy in on the plan. Risk management is absolutely critical, hypercritical in new product development. So again, early and continuous management and mitigation of project risks is a key part of this. Considering multiple design options, taking a set-based approach rather than picking the first concept that we think might work and pursuing it ad nauseum. Here we're going to take a broader look, cast a wide net, systematically down-select to the most effective solution. Of course, that leads directly into closing of knowledge gaps on a project. And lastly, of course, not least, manufacturability, cost, and quality. Early and continuously, really true concurrent development of the manufacturing processes and the product design as we go through the process. Another fundamental principle is really at the working level, trying to achieve both this true cross-functional collaboration, but there's another side to that, which is personal accountability. One of the words that's most commonly used, I think, in the hiring process and also in sort of developing people is empowerment. I probably should have made a poll question on this, but who doesn't want to be empowered? I mean, everyone thinks that that's a wonderful thing. But there's another side to empowerment if we want to actually execute on a project, and that is empowerment has to come with accountability. If you're empowered within a sphere of influence on a project, that's a wonderful thing. You've got decision control, decision rights, etc. But we have to be accountable to that. Otherwise, the project drifts and falters. So it's not all wonderful and fuzzy. How do we get people to make commitments personally, to do their very best to achieve those commitments, and work together collaboratively as a team to achieve the goals and milestones of a project? And you'll see, among other things, visual tools help us significantly in that arena. Transition to visual communication, and I know all of you are, no doubt, immersed. We'll have a poll question later in how much visual management you use. This has become almost the dogma of Lean, really, but there's a reason why we do it, and sometimes we forget the reason. Certainly faster and more unambiguous comprehension. Being able to focus on the exceptions rather than on the unchanging background that's going fine. Common organizational language rather than decks of slides to communicate problems and issues. A big red dot is going to tell you something unambiguous, that there's something wrong. The quote at the bottom is one of my favorite quotes from Cicero, who's a politician at the time of Julius Caesar. The purpose of communication is not to be understood, it's to make it impossible to be misunderstood. Often we communicate, but it's a single-ended communication. We hope that people understand. We assume that they understand. But in reality, we've got multiple versions of the truth out there, and people interpret that in different ways. Visual communication allows us to have one version of the truth that's understood by all in the same way. And so this idea of making it impossible to be misunderstood is actually very critical, especially throughout the decision process of new product development. Again, knowledge-based development. We learn in every project that we execute, but unfortunately that knowledge, even if we do a lessons learned meeting or a post-mortem at the end of a project, most of those lessons, though they're incredibly valuable, end up in some black hole called SharePoint, never to be seen again. So how do we actually operationalize knowledge and learning? And so again, the idea here is if we actually capture the artifacts of the development process in a format that's immediately reusable, then the next team would be foolish not to draw on previous similar projects, examine those artifacts, and see what can be learned and what we can build on. And then lastly, common sense. I sort of jokingly say that it's taken me 20 years to make these tools this simple. And in reality, that's true. We can find many arcane tools, complex things that are incredibly theoretically effective. But the reality is that they'll never end up becoming institutionalized in the company. They die of their own weight. Too complex, too cumbersome, too much expertise required to make them work. So one of the key goals of the Lean product development methodology is a low barrier to entry. we're coming up with tools and methods here that can easily be communicated, understood, and used that are extremely effective. And so that balancing of simplicity, and of course I think that's the hallmark of lean manufacturing and lean enterprise, is simplicity with effectiveness. And that's really what we're aiming for. I kind of like the second quote here in part because it's my own. Common sense is something you already know once someone points it out to you. Many of the things you'll see in lean product development are things you've probably tried or experienced in one form or another, but perhaps they haven't been honed and refined, and most importantly, they haven't been integrated into a front-to-back methodology, and that's what we try to offer here. So I'm going to give you a quick look at this big framework, which I call an event-driven process. Lean product development spans a tremendous space. The typical workshop that I might run would be anywhere from 2 to 5 days of learning. There's a tremendous amount here. But the main thing that's sort of different from a big picture standpoint is this concept of using events. An event is just a structured cross-functional meeting. It's a standard work approach to a critical transformation within the product development process. We literally sequester a team in a room. We don't lock the doors, but almost. All the members that are critical to the process are included. All the functions are there. It's very democratic in the sense that everyone has a voice. Everyone is respected and enfranchised and heard. Tools are used to guide the process from input, which is defined. In fact, I'll show you a graphic on this in a minute. Inputs are well defined in advance, part of the standard work, so each discipline brings to the party critical information. The methodology of the event drives people towards good, solid, collaborative decision-making and convergence, and there's always a templatized output at the end that tells us when we're done. So when that template or templates are complete to the satisfaction of the teams and management, that event is closed. And so I'll give you some examples of the events. We're going to actually talk a little bit more about them as we go through the slides. But this is the structure of a typical event. Again, standard work preparation. Each discipline is given a list of deliverables that they are going to bring to the event. The event itself might last a few hours for the case of some events. In other cases, it might be a day or even 2 days. For example, we have one of the most powerful events is called the market requirements event. Input, voice of the customer, true voice of the customer, and any other understanding that we have of the market needs, the competitive products, etc. The output is a prioritized list of engineering design requirements, literally the scope of work for the project at hand. And that transformation may take several iterations, and it may take a day or 2 or 3, but it's absolutely pivotal in the success of the remainder of the project. So even though we're putting a fair amount of focus and attention up front, the reality is that this is going to drive the 6 months, year, 3 years of development that follows, and it couldn't be better time spent. The output, again, is a templatized output, and if there are open issues or TBDs, we capture those, assign actions, bring the team back together shortly thereafter when the information is available, merge that information, and close the event. So this is sort of the overall framework, front-to-back framework for a specific project. In Lean Product Development, we have a front end on this, which is the portfolio management, strategic development, business case development, and then resource capacity management. In a few minutes, we're going to have some poll questions on capacity management, so I don't have time to cover it in detail. I'll just tell you a simple sentence that if you take anything down as a note, write this down. More focus on fewer projects will give you better outcomes, faster outcomes, and over any period of time, more projects completed. The biggest mistake that most companies make is they're operating too much WIP, too much work in process. We're batching projects, diffusing our limited finite resources among too many active things at the same time. The same exact logic that applies to eliminating batching in the factory or in any other transactional process applies here. If you run a critical mass team on projects, the time to market is going to drop significantly. The teams are more focused, less distraction, less setup and changeover waste. We have that in product development. It's called switching costs. All of those things are minimized. If you instead have vastly more projects than are realistic for the number of people you have with the skills required, batching takes place. The lowest priority thing they're working on is slowing down the most important project in your firm. So then we go into the execution process. The market requirements event is the front end, literally the kickoff of a given project. followed directly by a project planning event and a risk mitigation event. Then as we get into the development, you notice there's a funnel there with two halves. The lower half is the manufacturing process development activity. And we use here the Toyota-inspired production preparation process, or 3P process, and there are events associated with that throughout development. On the top side, especially for projects where there's a high level of risk or a great deal of learning involved, we have something called the learning cycle events, which is using rapid learning cycles to converge quickly to an optimal design, beginning with a set of options, going through systematic and rapid learning, converging to an optimal choice for our design concept. Design review and freeze events, of course, as checks on our quality and meeting requirements. And even though it's in fine print there, visual workflow management is the connecting tissue. Functions on both sides of that funnel are meeting regularly, systematically, addressing issues and problems, managing the schedule, providing a rapid feedback and control process for execution. So we're up to a poll question, and I don't know whether we're going to have me do this, or were you going to step in, Paul, and do this for us?
If you would go ahead and read it, and then while you're reading it, I will release the poll question.
Okay, excellent. So just to read the slide to you, one of the greatest sources of waste in new product development is a lack of focus. Too many active projects without clear prioritization. It's fine to have a lot of active projects if they're clearly prioritized. So those projects that are very low on the priority scale literally will be on hold while higher priority work is done. That's fine. But the goal here is more focus. So please answer the following questions. It applies to your organization. How many concurrent project development assignments for a typical designer or developer would be the case in your firm? Excluding non-development work such as sustaining support in other projects in the field, or support of other products that are already in the field, what is typical for your firm? 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 5, or 5 or more?
We'll give everybody about 10 seconds or so to answer the question here.
Don't be embarrassed. Be honest.
Exactly.
I just did this, by the way. I was doing a large workshop, 50 or 60 people actually in Wisconsin, and I pulled the class on this one, and I was, at a certain level for me at least, somewhat horrified. The first question I asked was 1 to 2. Not a single hand went up in the room. 1 to 2. 2 to 3, I got a couple smatterings. By the time I got to 5 or more than half the class had 5 or more. And I will tell you what's optimal based on time studies I've done over the last 20 years. Optimal number is 2 to 3 with solid prioritization, so the most important project always comes first.
So the results of our poll here, 15%, 1 to 2, 35%, 2 to 3, 30%, 3 to 5, and 20%, 5 or more.
Well, that matches pretty well with the sampling that I just took. So this sort of segues directly into the next question. In the world of lean manufacturing, we've learned that batching of products can cause excessive work in process, reduce quality. Just imagine if you're operating and working concurrently on 5 or 6 or 7 projects, how difficult it is to maintain your focus and quality and not make mistakes on any one of those. I mean, that's a contributing factor beyond the fact that we're batching. So it increases overall cycle time. Your time to market, if that's a concern to you, is driven by the number of concurrent projects that are active. Applying this concept, what do you think would be optimal? I've kind of given you a hint, but what do you believe would be an optimal number of projects for any designer or developer?
Again, we'll take just a short period of time here. Give everybody a chance. So that typical result that you had earlier, is that what you tend to see everywhere you go?
It's absolutely, it's ubiquitous. And it doesn't seem to even be industry specific. You would think that products that are much more complex, where the teams are larger, that would sort of mitigate in favor of fewer projects with more focus. And in fact, that's not the case. Often the long-term projects are being mixed in with special orders and minor line extensions and cost reduction projects and things of that sort. So even though a person has one big project, they've got a half dozen other smaller things that they're trying to juggle at the same time. And of course we have to do some of that. I mean, we have to be realistic here. A dedicated team is not optimal. In fact, it turns out in my time studies that people who are working in dedicated team format actually had a lot of stand time. They had a lot of slack time. And there wasn't a great deal that they could do during that waiting period for materials or information or whatever. So if they had a backup project or even a second backup project, they could be moving those projects along effectively. As long as the priorities are clear, 2 to 3 actually turns out to be sort of the optimal utilization of resources.
So the results we have for today, 47% said 1 to 2, 49% said 2 to 3, 2% 3 to 5, and 1% 5 or more.
I ought to ship a free book to the person who said 5 or more. They definitely are on the outside end. And listen, the reality of it is that we have to migrate slowly towards this more focused approach. We're not going to overnight say, okay, whatever you're working on, just kill off the bottom 3 and do the top 2. But over time, that should be a goal for any organization, to avoid this sort of excessive whip, to drive towards few-piece flow, if not one-piece flow. So I'm going to move on. So with our remaining time, I'm going to share with you, again, one of the most popular and successful tools that I teach, which is something called visual workflow management. This is a methodology that applies to any project. In fact, it actually applies to support teams, any team-based activity, and it allows you basically to solve some of the critical problems of managing, especially to a schedule, a planned project. So I've got here 3 secrets, and the reason why I bring these up is because visual workflow management strongly enables all 3 of these things, and I'll go through them quickly with you. It's not much of a secret since I'm obviously sharing it with all of you, so if you just don't tell anyone, then it'll stay a secret. Number 1, you need to fight for every milestone. One of the biggest mistakes we make is we accumulate slip at the beginning of a project, especially longer-term projects. Say a 2-year time frame, the team just doesn't take it seriously for the first several months. I mean, come on, we got plenty of time. But the reality is that every milestone in your plan, if you've done it right, is roughly equal risk and equally challenging. So if you accumulate slips at the beginning of the project, you've now got to pay that price later on. So the trick here is rapid feedback. If I slip that first milestone, I'm going to fight like heck to get back on schedule by the very next milestone. If you want an analogy here, the analogy would be tack time. So what is among the many things that tack time helps us with is you can start the month in the production on a production line, and within a few hours you know whether you're hitting your pace or not. And if you're not hitting your pace, what do? Do you allow that to backlog and backlog for 3, 4, 5 days before you say, well, we got to fix that? No, immediately you try to catch up so you get back onto your tack time. Exactly the same thing here. Milestones within a project plan represent a measure of the pace of work. And so if we slip that first milestone by any significant amount, we better be working hard to get back well by the next or the one after that. Otherwise, that accumulated slip will become impossible to catch up, and we find this bulge at the end where we end up slipping. The history of product development projects, by the way, is abysmal with respect to schedule fidelity. The typical adherence to schedule, the numbers that I've gathered and heard are 30% on time. And personally, I believe that's after 2 or 3 replans that they actually, those 30%. Because virtually no product development project comes in on the original plan. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them, and certainly a significant one, is allowing too much slip at the beginning of the project. Secret number 2 is kind of a surprise even for people that are seasoned project managers. The trick to managing to schedule is not managing the end date of tasks, it's managing the start date. If an activity doesn't start on time, its potential for ending on time drops rapidly. And we can manage that proactively. So what would stop a task from starting on time? Either the dependencies are not met, meaning that whatever information or material is needed to start that task isn't available. That's something the team can focus on and resolve. The other one, of course, the other possibility is the resource isn't available or resources are not available. And again, that's something that we can proactively mitigate if we know about it. So again, we want to always try to be proactively managing any schedule because unlike money, time can't be inventoried and it can't be bought back. If we slip, we've slipped. You can have throw all the money in the world at it and it's not going to gain you back schedule you've lost. So the goal here is proactively managing start dates. And the last one, the critical path of a project determines the overall duration. The longest series of serially dependent tasks on any project is the long pole in the schedule tent. So ultimately what we want to do is fight to understand the critical path, first of all, and fight and focus on the critical path. The whole team should know who's on the critical path at any time in a project. And just like blockers in football, if you don't have the ball, you're blocking for the person who does. You're helping them out. You're making sure they have what they need. You may be even offloading some activities that are, neutral functionally that other people can do to try to enable that person at every step in the project. So there's two pieces to visual workflow management. They work together in very tight synergy. They are actually sort of separate tools, but we work together, use them together. The first one is the stand-up meeting. This is variously called Scrum, which is an Agile term. And I will mention, by the way, that my methodology is 100% aligned with the Agile development methodology. Agile is primarily focused on soft products, not just software, but service products and other things. This works for both hardware and software, but it's virtually identical in many of its methodologies and tools. And in particular, the stand-up meeting and a Scrum meeting is basically the same thing for all intents and purposes. Short duration, but somewhat more frequent than the typical weekly or biweekly hour, 2-hour-long dirge that we typically use for team coordination. This is more energetic, it's more focused, and of course it's tied now to the other tool, which is some form of a visual project board. The team meets in front of the board is updated in real time in the stand-up meeting. It always represents 24/7 the current status of the project. So between those two things, what we have is a rapid feedback and control system. And this kind of illustrates why that can help you. The speed of work that a team can perform is based on the availability of resources. So if a team has a certain number of people with a certain number of hours that are available to do project work, that determines how fast they can move. It's basically a kind of a fundamental principle. Hours of effort available, hours of effort needed. However, how we spend that speed is determined by the direction we're going. So in the case up above, in the blue lines, even though we're operating at a certain speed, we're not making a lot of progress towards the end of the project. We're doing a lot of lateral motion. Time wasted on perhaps misunderstandings, things that are needed that are not provided when they should be, decisions that need to be made immediately but unfortunately are delayed for a week to the next coordination meeting. Surprisingly enough, it's sort of death by 1,000 cuts. By using more frequent stand-up meetings, we actually can straighten that line out. We can increase the amount of vector that's pointing towards the end. Literally, at the same speed, we have a higher velocity. And what I've done in some of my time studies with companies that have been doing this for a number of years, we've actually found 10 to 20% improvement in schedule just by virtue of using the stand-up meeting project board format without any of the other tools. Just the fact that we are now feeding back more quickly, resolving issues in more of a just-in-time way. There's a number of benefits on the right. You can see teams there as small as 2, 3, 4 people can use a stand-up meeting and project board. Upper limit of this is typically 10 to 15 people. If it's any larger than that as a stand-up meeting, it starts becoming somewhat chaotic. So if you have a very large team in your organization, you might consider separate meetings for subsystems or perhaps separate meetings for different phases of the project that might be going on to try to keep the numbers in that 10 to 15 or under range. Without reading all of the bullets to you, clearly the feedback is a critical part of this. Early detection of schedule slips, risks and issues, clear work plan for each task that's coming up, alignment and synchronization of all the functions so everyone knows what everyone else is doing and can synchronize their work, their needs and feeds with others. And the bottom one is probably the most important. Builds team identity and emotional commitment. Teams getting together 2, 3 times a week, focusing on issues and problems, talking with each other. And I want to emphasize the stand-up meeting and project board are owned by the team. This is not a team leader tool to help make their job easier, though it will, absolutely. It is intended to be team-owned. So the stand-up meeting is not everyone talking to the team leader. The stand-up meeting is everyone talking to each other. And the project board is owned by the team. It's updated by them. You'll see in a little bit, each person has their own swim lane. They own that swim lane. So now we've got the empowerment and accountability piece taken into account. So what goes on? First of all, the frequency of the stand-up meeting is a feedback process. So to some degree, it should be determined by the speed at which work is progressing. But what I found from a lot of experience in this is 2 to 3 times a week seems to be ideal. A daily meeting is something, I used to teach daily stand-up meetings. But what I found is that there just isn't enough changing between meetings to justify those extra everyday type activities. So 2 to 3 times a week breaks that time batch of a week or two into shorter increments with better feedback. Even 2 times a week will give you a tremendous benefit over just having a weekly meeting. So a Monday, Wednesday, or Thursday, or a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, roughly equally beneficial. And by the way, the duration of the stand-up meeting is critical. 15-minute duration for the formal part of the meeting, which is where each person reports, speaks, and we go around the team. We have an informal after meeting for any parked issues that come up that require more discussion. But if we stay focused and we keep it energized, 15 minutes is entirely reasonable, even for a team of 10 or 15 people. What do people say? 3 questions down at the bottom of the slide. The first one, what progress have you made since the last meeting? Tell us about what you're actually doing, not just still working on the widget or I'm 20% complete. What are you doing? I'm doing some finite element analysis, or I'm running some circuit simulations, or I'm looking at some processes in the factory and I'm seeing how they might work. Tell us what you're doing. Make it interesting and also help the team see the big picture. That's question number 1. Number 2 follows directly from that. What are your plans going forward? What are the next things you'll be doing? What are your priorities moving forward? The most important question is the last one. What issues or problems are you facing that could cause you to delay? And this is, again, proactive. I want to hear anything that could potentially cause a person to not hit whatever their current commitments are. So if you're being pulled off to do sustaining support, if you've got another project that's higher priority that's drawing you away, if you don't have the things you need, if your dog's sick and you need to take him to the vet, I don't care. I need to know in advance. It does me no good as a team member or team leader to find out after you've already slipped the milestone that you had a legitimate excuse. It might be legitimate, but I can't buy back that time and I can't fix it. On the other hand, if I know in advance that something's potentially going to cause a delay, I may be able to mitigate it. If I can't mitigate it, at a minimum, at least the team can plan around the slip and not waste their time expecting something that won't be there. So 3 questions, and this is energetic. So you bang out the 3 questions and you go right to the next person on the team. One trick here, if you don't hear a person say, I have no issues or problems, ask them, whoever's facilitating. And I like to rotate facilitation among the whole team. Team leader starts it out perhaps to get things rolling, and then after that each week pick a different person to facilitate. If you don't hear, I don't have any issues, ask. Because often these things are suffering in silence, and then you find out later that it turns into a showstopper. So we move through the room when the last person, typically the team leader is usually the last person to speak, to catch anything that was missed and maybe give any big picture direction that's necessary. The formal part of the meeting is over. You'll see in a minute we're going to update our project board. As we go through these answers, we'll be updating the project board. I mentioned again, we have a formal stand-up meeting, 15 minutes, but often some technical issue will come up during the stand-up meeting, which causes people to go off on a tangent. And of course, your 15 minutes is going to be killed almost immediately. So one of the tricks that I've learned from some rough experience on this is anyone on the team can propose that we park an issue. Not just the team leader, because they're often the worst. They'll dig in and, it becomes a 2-person conversation. So anyone can say, hey guys, let's park that. We hold that topic until everyone has had a chance to speak, the formal part's done, and then we have an informal after meeting. Anyone who wishes to stay and discuss those parked issues is welcome to stay, have an ad hoc meeting. Anyone who is not involved in those issues can go back to work. And so we can use this as a clearinghouse for issues without having everyone have to sit around listening to things that they're really not involved in or can contribute to. So we're up to our 3rd poll question. This is our last one, and I'll read this to you. So obviously visual communication is absolutely fundamental to much of Lean, the Lean improvement methodology. So let's answer the question for your organization. Have you implemented visual communication in management? If so, in what areas is it in use? So we often start with manufacturing. That's kind of the A answer, manufacturing only. May have extended it into front office, administration, or accounting. Have you gone as far as all of the above plus engineering and development, or have not implemented visual communication?
Ron, while everybody's answering that question, we had a question come up. Is the stand-up meeting the same as triage being used in the IT industry? And is 1 minute a realistic time per attendee?
Okay, so it's not the same as triage. Triage is more of a reactive situation to we have a problem. It's kind of a tiger team format. The meetings may be very similar, but this is an ongoing process. Even if the project is healthy and happy and moving along all in the green, we're still having the stand-up meeting to keep it on that plan. So though they're almost identical in terms of how you might approach them, the intent of the meeting is somewhat different. And I'll tell you, I wish I had time to show you the slides, but I actually have 3 slides that I cooked up because people were skeptical about is 1 minute really enough. And what I actually did was I wrote a little paragraph as to what I would consider a reasonable response from a person designing a circuit board, is the example I used. And then I read it slowly to myself and clocked myself and put the times on the slides, and it ended up being 45 seconds. The key is discipline. It's a rhythm that we get into. We don't need to know the details. For example, I might say, if I'm designing a circuit board, well, over the last few days, I ran some circuit simulations, and it looks as though I've got everything set pretty well, but I do have a little bit of a noise loop that I've found. My plans moving forward are that I'm going to dig in on that little noise loop. It's probably a ground plane problem, and I probably should have that resolved over the next couple of days. I don't have any current issues except for the fact that if for some reason this ground loop became a problem, it could be a showstopper that could cause me a delay. I think that what I just said took about 20 seconds, maybe 25. So if you doubled that, you still would be within the minute. That would be a typical thing that we'd be listening for. And with a little bit of practice, people get into that rhythm, and they're prepared in advance, and they know just what they're going to say.
Excellent. The answer to the poll questions, 35% in manufacturing only, 14% in manufacturing plus office admin, 24% all of the above plus engineering and development, 27% no visual at all.
That's actually really good, especially the answer to C. The opportunity in engineering development is huge. I'm really glad to hear that a good percentage of the attendees are trying that. And if you haven't tried it, don't be afraid of it. I mean, it will absolutely work for you. It is no different in terms of its benefit. The only trick is that the engineering or development world tends to be a little more skeptical of tools like this. So one strong suggestion, don't package this as, well, we're taking something from the factory that works and we're imposing it on engineering. If you do that, you're almost certainly going to get resistance, if not rejection. Bring it in as a tool for engineering and let the teams actually feedback, change, adapt to what they believe will help them. If something works, that's my main criterion. It may not look exactly like what's in my book or what's in a slide. If you can get something that's working for you, you can build on that over time to make it more robust. So give the team sort of some basic concepts, perhaps like the next few slides. Let them play with it, take some ownership of it, create something that will help them and they believe in, and then you can kind of take a look at it and maybe over time evolve it to be either more rigorous or more comprehensive in what it's accomplishing. So I'm going to continue on. We're obviously coming up on our time limit, so I want to give you the visual board part of this. This is a sort of a standard generic project board, and it's a good example of what a project board will do. On the left-hand side, there's 2 elements, and this is for a product development project. We have versions of this for virtually any environment, functional boards, support and on-demand services boards, but I'm going to focus on a product development single project board. On the left, there's 2 elements. These are the sources of work for the team. If you want to use more of a manufacturing lean kind of concept, these are the demands on the team. Upper left is the planned work, the work that the team has to get done based on the schedule that they created. So things we know we have to do, and we've got milestones and due dates. Unplanned work is the other piece. This is anything else. Risks that become issues, added scope that comes along that isn't already in the plan, something we forgot that should have been in the plan, but we didn't get it in the plan. In theory, that unplanned work is empty. In practice, there's always things in there. And again, one of our key goals is to try to get that unplanned work bin emptied as quickly as possible. If we see something pop in there, we try to squeeze it in a crack to maintain our plan. If it builds up to being too much effort, we may need to trigger a replan, absorb the unplanned work into the plan, and empty that bin. The center section of the board is kind of the most interesting part. This is a 2-week rolling window action plan. It's an informal kind of a magnifying glass on the overall project schedule, focusing on a 2 to 4 week period. I'm showing 2 weeks here. You could have a week 3 and a week 4. I just used a week 3 plus to show the overflow. Notice that each of those people, Tom, Dick, and Harry, those are all members of the team, each one typically representing a different function. So these are functional swim lanes going across the middle of the board. Those little squiggly things are Post-it notes that identify commitments that that individual is going to do towards whatever is their next task or milestone. So the goal here is that as we meet, we're going to update that column. Let's say it's the Monday meeting. We're going to update that column. When people answer the first question, what have we accomplished over the last period, they would update any Post-it note in the Monday box if it's the Monday meeting. If it's on time, it gets pulled off. If it slips, it would move to the right with a notation of the new commitment date. Each week, the window rolls another week, so we're always looking 2 weeks ahead, always current week and next week, and then overflow. On the right is general project information. I always like to have a project timeline focusing on the critical path, a plan versus actual chart. I have a tool called a risk burn down tool. We won't have time to cover it here, but that's a visual tool representing the overall risks on a project. That's a nice thing to put up there. And I always have a parking lot for unresolved issues. If we don't know what to do with it, I never lose anything. So if something comes up in the meeting, not sure where to put it, we stick it on a Post-it, put it in the parking lot, and we'll disposition it at the next meeting. So again, this is all connected. If we do this in a rigorous fashion, the master schedule drives that upper left-hand planned work template, which is just a task list derived directly from the master schedule, and then that would drive the Post-it notes that are going on the center of the board. It's all connected together with task ID numbers. So if I'm on schedule in that center of the board with those little Post-it notes, I know that I'm on schedule to the master schedule. So this is literally just taking, again, a magnifier to the master schedule and allowing us to informally and dynamically plan the details. This is often called sprint planning, meaning that we're allowing for the fact that we have a big milestone up there, but the way we get there could be very different depending on the conditions at that time when we approach the milestone, so we can dynamically adjust to have our best shot at being able to hit the milestone that's coming up, or milestones. This is just an example of what might be on the Post-it notes. If you had a 4-week task on the master schedule, I would ask whoever owns that task to break it up into incremental steps, call them work packages. 2 to 5 day duration is the granularity we're looking for. Each one of these would be written by the person who owns the task. No one assigns anything to you but you. So if you know there's a task coming up that you have responsibility for, it's your job to decide how long things are going to take and what the actual milestones or checkpoints would be. No one's going to do that but you, but the goal, of course, is that you're going to now track to that on the board so the team is aware of what you're doing and whether you're staying on your plan. So again, blowing up the center of the board, the Monday column at the end of a Monday meeting is empty. Everyone will have reported on the Post-it notes that they have in their bin for that Monday segment. If they have nothing, they would just discuss the upcoming activities and the status of those. When you answer your second question, which is what are you planning to do next, you might propagate some additional Post-it notes into the end of week 1 and on to week 2 and beyond. And then, of course, any issues or problems, you might put something either in the parking lot or into unplanned work. But the board is updated in real time as you're doing the stand-up meeting. By the way, you don't have to sit and watch people fill out Post-it notes. A person can report, answer their 3 questions. If it involves putting some Post-its up on the board, they can do that as the next people are talking. So we don't have to sit and watch people write. This is a typical Post-it note. Name of the person who owns it. Again, they fill this out, their own hand, if humanly possible. Date for completion. This is their personal commitment to get whatever's on the Post-it done by that date. Task ID number, always included, so we can reference back and know that this Post-it applies to this task on the master schedule. And then a brief description of some measurable progress point or checkpoint aiming for whatever their milestone would be. Here's a picture. This is actually a 5-day-a-week team, so you see that there's 5 columns each week, week 1 and week 2, basically in the same format. This is a more advanced version, which is actually a powerful tool. This is a multi-project board for what I call a super team. It's a cross-functional team that does continuing engineering and special order work. And you can see on the left, they're actually operating something like 10 projects simultaneously. And on the right, they're using a similar board to what I just described. The only difference is now we're using the color of the Post-it note to indicate which project they're working on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So this is actually an excellent way to coordinate either a functional area or a cross-functional team that does multiple smaller projects. And again, to fill out the rest of the board on the right-hand side, this is something called a risk burn-down tool. Without going into too much detail because of our time limitation, I want to allow time for questions. But the vertical axis is basically a risk rating that's based on a risk register that has detailed risks identified and rank ordered. But we merge that information into a metric, which we put, and each bar represents a revision of the risk register as we go through the project. This encourages the team to revise that risk register every month, which I believe is a best practice. So the height of the bar determines the overall risk, and you can see kind of a red, yellow, green zone. When the project's in the red zone, that's scary time. Usually at the front end, that's often the case. We get into yellow, we believe we're starting to get a grip on things. But when we get down into the green, we have a relatively high assurance that the end date is safe and that the project is going to end up closing successfully. Probably many of you are thinking, well, this is all great, but we have teams that are geographically dispersed and maybe even in different buildings that are half a mile away, which I've seen in some large campuses. Is this a realistic tool to use? And I will tell you that a physical board works better. Those of you that are long-term Lean practitioners know that there's some human engineering here. Having the team standing around while you go up and do either the walk of shame or walk of fame on the board is a critical factor in making this work. But I've been very successful at implementing virtual versions of this. In some cases, 150 or more boards in every continent almost, spanning the globe. There's many ways to do it. One of the most popular and successful ones is to use a smart board instead of a physical board. You can set up a dedicated room with a smart board and perhaps even video conferencing, flat screen TV, hang mics. And people can actually go up and drag and drop virtual Post-it notes, hand write on them, and it's captured. You can write into your Excel templates, and it captures the handwriting as text and saves it. And then, of course, this gets archived to a SharePoint site, and the next team can come in and use the same room. So instead of having to have a lot of boards all around, this is a very powerful way of still having some of that human factor of physical interaction with the board while having the virtual advantages. And, of course, this would be done as a webcast, so you rotate control to the different locations, and they would update their portions of the board. This is a picture. Actually, this comes from Western Digital, which is the largest implementer that I have in my client base. Again, about 150 boards, Singapore, Japan, China, U.S. in 3 locations in Europe. And what they did was kind of low-tech and very powerful. They're using physical boards here, but with a high-resolution security camera shining on the board. They put a flat-screen TV in, hang mics, and basically it's become kind of an informal video conference room. They're still using the physical boards, but using the security cameras, you can actually view the boards and even zoom and pan from anywhere in the world. So if you're an executive, you can sit in an airport somewhere in Singapore and look at any project board anywhere globally for your company. The total cost of this room implementation was $8K, which is actually less slightly than the cost of the smart board, and you still preserve that physical interaction. So there's many different solutions for a virtual approach. I do recommend prototyping first with a physical board, learning how it works, figuring out the format, and then you can always make it into a virtual tool. So with that, let's answer some questions.
Okay, Ron, we have several questions. So we're at about 6 minutes left for everybody out there in the webinar. I bet we probably have, I would estimate 15 to 20 minutes of questions. So if you need to leave, we understand that. What we will do is we will continue to record all of this. So if you want to come back and hear the answers to the questions, you can go to our YouTube video and you can scroll it back to the end unless you want to hear Ron again, which would be great. You can scroll to the end and you can listen to all the answers to the questions. So first, how do you overcome the traditional engineering mindset that limits change? and it has NIY behind that, which I assume means not invented here.
I found cattle prods work well. Unfortunately, it's a big challenge. Again, I think maybe the most critical key here is there's a great quote, and I wish I could attribute it to someone, but I just heard it. And the quote is that you can accomplish anything you want in an organization as long as you don't take credit for it. So I guess what the meaning here is, let the engineering team, prompt them into this, give them some sort of generic tools and examples, and then let them take ownership of it and make it theirs. So it would be invented here. Yeah, you might have been the one who instigated it, but then back off and let them use this in a way that makes sense for them initially. A little guidance and coaching, maybe kick them along a little bit, but that's certainly one of the things. And the other is, please, I've had more stories of people say, well, we hired this big, I won't name the names, but this big, incredibly respected Toyota-based consultancy, and they came in, worked in the engineering group, and the first thing they did was they started 5S'ing people's desks, and they started banging the table on standard work, and you're just going to lose all credibility without even getting started. So this is not about it's not doing the same thing as we do in the factory. It's using the same principles, the same fundamentals, but adapted to a very different world. It's a world of risk, of uncertainty, of non-recurring activities, of invention. It's a different world. If you think it's the same world, you're probably going to fail. So get someone within the engineering group or the development group that you believe has both credibility and some intuition and understanding of what Lean's all about, and use them as a vector to start selling it within the organization.
Is there such a thing as too much information?
Yes, actually, I'll tell you what, that's a really good question. If you work with visual, you've probably run into this, and it happens in engineering in spades. If a couple of different colors of Post-it note is good, then all 24 3M available colors is better. And oh, by the way, they have smiley faces and kitty faces and colored dots on colored Post-its. I've seen some boards where even the person who set them up has no idea what everything means. So here's a simple rule of thumb. If after a week or two of using a project board, if anyone on the team has to ask the question, what color of Post-it are we using for that, it's too complicated. So give it a couple of weeks because, there's a little bit of learning curve there. If you get to the point where you have so much noise on the board that it loses its benefit, then there's ambiguity being introduced, and it reduces down to being just a mess. And it will die of its own weight, undoubtedly. I'd rather err on the side of simplicity than err on the side of trying to do everything with everyone and end up failing at all of it. So keep it simple.
This one was actually earlier on, so you may have already answered it. What would you suggest as the first step to implementing Lean new product?
Well, certainly I would say the visual project boards are usually the first step in most companies. There's two tools that almost always take hold first. One of them is the risk management, risk mitigation event. Because it's easy, you can implement it at any point in a project, even if it's a midstream project, you can always go in, it never hurts you to look at risks, and it gives you some very powerful and tangible outputs. So it's kind of a low barrier to entry tool. And then the visual boards. One of the advantages of the visual boards is it is the one thing in Lean product development that's actually visual. We're not reorganizing the desks to achieve flow. We're not doing, you can do 5S if you want. I've not found any great benefit to it. But this is visual. So if people see these things up on the wall, they realize we're doing something new and different. And if they see stand-up meetings happening, it tends to go viral pretty quickly. People go, oh, wow, they're using that board, and yeah, maybe we ought to set up a board too. As long as you maintain some control over what's going on, these things can take on a life of themselves, and then, of course, there's a bit of a pull to say, well, what else can we do? And that's more of the hidden things that might require a little bit more effort to implement.
This one was also a little bit earlier. How does the team gain ground after slipping? And the person talks, I believe this was David, talks about historically it drops back to whoever is the primary supporter of the project. So any other suggestions there?
Well, unfortunately, I try to resist replanning as much as possible. There are times when we just have to say, you know what, there's no way realistically just beating the team over the head or, having them do the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is probably not going to work, and we just need to reset the clock. And if we replan, it's a new project, and give the team a new chance of success. But that being said, I have in the Lean Product Development methodology something called a visual planning event. If you've slipped schedule, holding one of those events with the expressed purpose of finding a way to get back on plan can be very powerful. So we're going to, nail the critical path. We're going to look at early start opportunities. We'll look at resource constraints and where we may be able to, selectively pack in some resources to pull ourselves in. So that's actually, we can use that tool both in the initial planning, but also as a get well methodology for the team to come together and try to find a solution.
Get a couple of questions about, I think you talked about a typical project time. First question was, what is world-class benchmarking for product development in terms of days? And what is a typical project time that you referenced in your presentation?
So this is a really tough question. I'm going to give you a kind of a broad answer here. First of all, I'll give you an example. I was working with a company recently that had a very long, for their type of product, a very long development time, excessively long. But what they were selling this initiative to improve with is they were citing companies like Twitter and Uber and Facebook and companies like that and saying, well, all of these new modern companies are so fast and we're so slow. None of the products or companies that they cited actually made a physical product. So the first answer is, if you make a soft product, your development times should undoubtedly be significantly different and shorter. In fact, in a soft product environment, you should be looking at a pipeline of releases with version control, but you might do a mid-year release and an end-of-year release, and whatever's ready, you put it in. It shouldn't be, how long does my project take? You should be looking more at a pipeline strategy with a fairly short period between releases. Physical products are often driven by things like life testing, regulatory approval, tooling and material lead times, factory setup and equipment prove-in times. Those things are very hard to shrink. So the front end of the process, up to the point of having the detailed design and getting into a qualification testing mode, we can accelerate pretty dramatically. Once we get into that sort of long, non-effort-driven part of the project, there's not a lot we can do. There may be some tricks and some incentives, but that's kind of the hard pole in the tent. If you want a general answer, if you discount all of that end of the project stuff, 6 months to a year to develop a reasonably simple product, a year to a year and a half, 18 months to get to that point of being ready to qualify would be a reasonable best-in-class. It's not realistic, in my opinion, to develop any complex product in anything less than a year. I mean, you could do it with a crash project, but it would probably create a bow wave of destruction in the organization.
Any recommendations on how to gain buy-in from front office, administration, or engineering for visual communication? And kind of followed up and said, even in manufacturing, it requires a continuous push to maintain and use visual communication.
It's going to be the same in engineering or in any other aspect of Lean Enterprise. I refer to it as the entropy effect. Right? Entropy is the tendency of the universe to become more random over time. If you don't put constant organizing energy in, at least until it becomes entrenched in the organization and the culture, it's going to fall apart. There's no question. So you need someone or a group within your organization who's going to put in that, that persistent energy. I always say persistence, not insistence. So we need persistent energy. Simplest way to do this is to find advocates. There's maybe 1 out of 10 people in engineering will be excited about the idea of using this something new and different, and they'll see the benefit. Cultivate those advocates, even to the extent of carving out a piece of their time, and part of their review as an employee would be to make these things happen. But the most important thing is you need someone there who's going to own it and be persistent in making sure it stays working, gathering feedback, keep it moving forward. Without that, I don't think there's any way that you can get any of these tools to work. Change is difficult, and people will come up with all kinds of justifiable reasons why they're helpless to do something new. And, the job of an advocate or a change agent is to overcome those obstacles, to keep the pressure on until the benefits and the culture change to the point where it becomes the status quo. Then people will fight to protect it. But it takes 6 months, a year, maybe 2 or 3 before it really changes the culture and the late adopters get on board. So, we just got to kind of accept that. That's part of the process. Got to do it.
What tool do you use to allow or disallow scope creep?
Oh, I use what's called staged freezing. This is something that actually Don Reinertson wrote about this back in Managing the Design Factory, and even earlier, I think, in Developing Products in Half the Time. I have a design review set of events, but I use every design review, and I have several of them. I typically will do an early concept review, we'll do a detailed design review, a launch to production or final design review. Each one of these, we put a freeze list associated with the event. So the goal is, when you're done with this review, assuming everything is good, we are agreeing as a team and management that we're freezing these particular aspects of the project. It's unrealistic to say we're going to freeze the entire concept, because often there's things that are still subject to change because of customer needs changing or competitive moves, but we freeze as much as we believe we can, and more importantly, as much as we need to ensure that we can have schedule fidelity with a launch date. So the trick here is the design review is kind of a knowledge gate. If we pass through the design review, we should be ready to freeze some or all of the aspects of that product at that point in the project. By the way, it's fairly common to defrost that frozen design, so we got to be real about it. But what it does is it puts a little bit of a barrier up that says we're not going to window shop here and trickle in scope creep throughout the project. It's a formal process of change if you unfreeze an item, so you better have a really good business reason for doing it.
This is about a specific slide, I think, that you presented. Under unplanned MSC priority, what does MS and C mean?
Oh, very good. Sorry about that. MSC stands for must, should, could. This is another one of the Lean tools we use to create a prioritization within design requirements. So must have, should have, could have kind of means, I want to make sure, I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. Because I'm thinking that it was just on the, no, that would have been it, must, should, could. The goal here is to identify requirements in the context of, are they must-haves, are they should-haves or could-haves. Must-haves are minimum marketable requirements. Should-haves are basically the design goal. Could-haves are stretch goals. And so we use that as a way of creating a more nuanced language of requirements to give the team a picture of a trade space instead of just a point design that they're aiming for.
Elaborate briefly on slide 24, the risk management visual. Okay.
So I think I may have answered that already a little bit further on when I showed this slide. And again, this is I call it a risk burn down tool. The goal here is that each month the team refreshes their what I call a risk register, which is a prioritized list of project risks. And as mitigation and learning and accomplishment kind of feed into that risk register, we should see that metric or indicator is dropping. If it doesn't drop, as I showed there on the 5th bar from the left, if it pops up, that indicates some new risk or some concern has come along that was unexpected, and that might trigger either management involvement, or at least the team would need to do some firefighting or mitigation plan for that new risk. So I think I covered the rest of it later on in my talk.
What tool do you use or process to determine the critical path?
This is, I will tell you, I've been doing project management for over 35 years, and I still hate Gantt charts. I've always hated Gantt charts, and I probably hate Microsoft Project more than I hate Gantt charts. I hate it, but it's a necessary evil. Why? We can do a lot of things with visuals, and in fact, we do visual planning using Post-it notes on a wall. We create the initial plan, but we need an electronic format because critical path is the one thing that is subject to very, very difficult trying to find it on a manual plan or on an Excel plan or something like that, and we absolutely need to know that it's there. So I use Microsoft Project or Primavera or Liquid Planner, tool of your choice. As long as it does automated critical path identification, that's a tool you can use. And I use it continuously because any change, especially if you have multiple parallel paths, any change to any duration along those parallel paths could cause the critical path to shift. And we want to be really mindful of where that is. So I hate to say it, but that's probably the one thing you really need an automated tool to tell you is where's the critical path, and even to the extent of inserting a little slack time on the critical path to find out what's called the shadow paths, those things that are just behind it that'll bite you if you don't pay attention to them. You really need an automation tool. I don't typically recommend software tools only because I can't stay up on the new technology enough to be able to make a good recommendation. But the three that I mentioned are some of the standards.
On slide 33, what software was used to create the visual management board?
Okay, so in this case, it was not created. There's no software here. This is just a camera on a physical board on the wall. But if you want to know, well, for example, here, I'll go to slide 32. This particular version that I'm showing you was created in Visio, which is just part of the Microsoft suite. I've seen them successfully built in Excel. But I will name, there are some software applications out there that are designed for visual management, sort of part of the Lean milieu. And I'll name a couple of those. I won't recommend one over the other, but the three that I've heard good things about. One's called IOBEA. The second one is called Lean Kit. And the third one is called Quillo. I think it's Quillo. I'm not 100% positive of the spelling. Those are the three that and again, you got to be really careful here. Because when you use canned software, even if it's very flexible, the tendency is to do things the way the software forces you to do them. I really recommend before you look at any software application for a virtual version to build some boards on the wall, even as test cases, and try them out. And first find out what your requirements really are, and then go search for a virtual tool, whether it's something as simple as Visio or something more advanced.
On slide 24, you have the risk chart. Do the bars represent the various types of risk that have been identified?
No, actually, the bars represent an aggregate metric of the overall risk on the project. So since we have a couple questions, I'll just answer that quickly. The height of the bar, you notice the y-axis has a scale from 0 to 25. I use a 1 to 5 metrics to assess risk, probability on a 1 to 5 scale, impact on a 1 to 5 scale. Then we multiply those two numbers together to create what's called a risk priority number, 25 down to 1. So in our risk register, we've identified all the detailed risks of all types. When we're done scoring them all, we sort high to low on that risk priority number, and then you just take the average of the top 10 risks. It gives a reasonably good picture of the overall risk profile on the project. So when you first build the risk register at the beginning of the project, you create the height of the first bar, which is probably going to be kind of high. Then what I try to do is insist every month the team goes back to the risk register and revises it. They don't have to recreate it, but they add new risks, they rescore risks that have been mitigated, and so forth. Then we just, again, sort high to low on the risk priority number, and we get a new average of the top 10, which should be lower as we move through a project. Even if we do nothing, as we go through discovery and concept development, a lot of these risks will either become issues or they'll go away. So that bar should follow something that's super linear, something that's more or less asymptotic, like I'm showing with the dotted line. The dotted line is not actually part of the tool. It's actually showing the trending you would expect from a typical project.
Actually,
I have about five more minutes, Paul, before I have another call starting. So,
and I think we're just about there. We're just about there. So one question actually comes up with the burn down chart, and that is not so much a question. Would you consider doing another webinar on just the risk burn down chart?
Actually, it would be very, I have a very powerful, the risk mitigation event in general, and this is part of it, is a really powerful part of the methodology. So that would be something I'd be more than happy to do. And I think probably would benefit anyone working, whether you're in functional or in projects.
Okay, cool. We'll talk about that. We have one last question here. How do you keep things from going back to the old way?
That's the snapback syndrome. I always refer to it as kind of like pulling on a bad spring. You know, what you kind of want is you want the spring to eventually, it's under tension for sure when you pull on it. You kind of like it to distort and stay where it is. The problem is there's always this tendency to fall back. So again, I'll just throw out the typical platitudes, but they're important. One of them is inputting of organizing energy for a long enough period of time so that the organization develops some stickiness for the new tool. And that takes a while. It's always underestimated. Executives think it takes about a month. Working level managers typically think it takes 6 months. And most of us that have been in the change business for a while know that it's years, several years. So the simplest way to do it, I think, is, and pardon me for using the term audit here, which has some negative connotations, but it's actually kind of easy. For example, if you set up a visual project board, all you have to do is encourage the managers within that organization to walk the boards once a month and just ask the team, tell me about your board. Why isn't this updated? Why is your risk burn down tool not caught up with this month? You're 2 months behind. Gee, tell me about this post-it. What does that mean? We always do where management is focused, right? If management's focused on project boards, you're going to get a good project board. And if management's not paying any attention whatsoever, it's probably going to lose some momentum. So it isn't very hard. Just set up a system where, roughly once a month or so, and take some notes. If you could do an audit, here's the areas where you kind of get dinged. Make a little scorecard, perhaps, of, they're up to date on this, they're doing that right, they're not quite doing this one. Make that a metric that you post, perhaps, so that each team kind of gets a little incentive to try to rise to the top in the metric. It doesn't take too much. The problem in almost every organization is, and please, understand, I'm not being insulting here, it's a lack of discipline. The fact that we don't do what we know we should do, that we said we were going to do, that we've even documenting we're going to do, but we don't do it. We normally know what to do. We're just not doing those things. These are low barrier to entry tools, which makes that easier. But if we don't have a feedback process that maintains that until it just becomes, knee-jerk part of the organization, these things will dissipate and eventually they'll fail.
Ron, I want to thank you for doing this. Excellent. I'm getting all sorts of good feedback on the question box here. So before we leave, is there any last final comments you would like to make before we leave here?
Oh, sure. The one thing I will say is that, we've had, don't have too high in expectations. People talk about, well, we're going to take our time to market, cut it in half. And sometimes that's possible, and often it just isn't. But there's nothing in the lean product development methodology that can harm you. This is kind of the Hippocratic Oath, where we'll do no harm. These methods are basically things that are doing what you're doing already. They're just doing them in a more efficient, more effective, simpler in many cases way. So don't fear this. This is not really going to disrupt your organization. We're basically just taking something you're already doing and giving you a better way of doing it. So don't fear this. It works, it's proven, and if you've got the energy and you're willing to adapt, this will give you a benefit for sure.
I am Paul Harbath, the 2016 Chair of the American Society of Quality Lean Enterprise Division webinar series. I want to thank Ron for his presentation and thank you for listening to Visual Tools for Lean Product Development. If you have any questions about the content of this webinar, feel free to contact Ron directly. Next month, our presenter will be George Tresellis. You can learn everything you want about the Toyota way. You can implement the tools they've created, but if you do not have the behaviors established within your culture, it will not be successful for long-term sustainment of operational excellence. Join George as he presents a webinar based on his 2016 Shingo Award-winning book, Developing Lean Leaders at All Levels, A Practical Guide. The American Society of Quality Lean Enterprise Division webinar series is the place for you to hear the best of the best in the lean industry and learn more about how to apply lean in your application. The American Society of Quality Lean Enterprise Division is a global network of professionals helping individuals and organizations apply proven and leading-edge lean principles and practices to achieve dramatic results for your personal and organizational success. Come lean with us.